Good evening, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Turin, and together with Ratna Shrestha, Tirang Sakya, Catherine Hacker, and Sarah Schneiderman, I'm a founding member of the UBC Himalaya program. Now, before going any further, I'd like to take a moment to not only acknowledge, but really recognize and reflect on our location here, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, who have been teaching and learning and living and nurturing these territories long before UBC was founded 102 years ago. And I thank the Musqueam community for their ongoing guidance and the direction they provide to the university as a whole. A few preliminaries before I introduce our speaker and this evening's program. The UBC Himalaya program draws upon faculty expertise, student engagement, community partnerships, and alumni to create an interdisciplinary hub for sharing knowledge from and about the Himalayan region, including Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Tibetan cultural zones that traverse all of those countries. Beginning in 2015, initial projects have included developing a language partner program to create opportunities for learning Nepali and Tibetan here at UBC in partnership with community members. We've developed a speaker and event series, and you can learn more about this semester's program of events at the back. There's a sheet printout with all the times and dates. And also creating an interdisciplinary network across UBC and the Lower Mainland with a broad constituency of community partners. It's been hugely satisfying in these few years to see such interest and engagement in our emerging program from students, from faculty, from staff, and from all of you. So thank you for coming this evening. Our program also runs a very modest, non-invasive email list that won't spam you, from which you can learn more about our events. So if you're interested to know when and what we're doing, please consider signing up. And I really wouldn't be in a position to stand here at all and talk about the work we do were it not for the support we've received from a large number of units across this campus. I'd like to recognize them and thank them today, and thereby also encourage them to continue supporting us. So we have the Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund from UBC, the UBC Center for Community Engaged Learning, the Institute for Asian Research, and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. This evening's unique program has specific supporters whom I'd like to recognize. Once again, UBC's Institute of Asian Research, the School of Public Policy, the Department of Anthropology, the Center for India and South Asian Research, and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Of course, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada is the organization that's provided some very important funding to bring us together, and the workshop that took place today. We remain particularly grateful to the Nepali Cultural Society of BC and the Trans-Himalayan Aid Society for their support, their sustained partnership, and their inspired leadership. Tonight's event is both the first public event of our academic year and also the keynote lecture for a startup workshop for this grant. The PI is Sarah Schneiderman, and the grant is named Expertise, Labor and Mobility in Nepal's Post-Conflict, Post-Disaster Reconstruction. UBC is collaborating with several other institutions, including the Social Science Baha in Kathmandu, Nepal, and we're delighted to have the director with us here today. We're also excited that in response to a wide interest among our community partners in the Lower Mainland, many of whom can't make the trek up to UBC this evening, we're able to offer a live stream of this lecture and the conversation that will follow with the technical and logistical support of our colleagues in the Irving K. Barber Learning Center here at UBC. So enough preliminaries to this evening's program. I'm so happy to have the pleasure of introducing our speaker to you. Deepak Thapa is director of the Social Science Baha, a research organization based in Kathmandu in Nepal. He's written extensively on Nepal's contemporary political developments. He's also a columnist with the Kathmandu Post, an educator, a writer, a journalist, a public intellectual, and a voice of calm reason in complex times. His book publications include Understanding the Maoist Movement of Nepal. He's also the co-author of A Kingdom Under Siege, Nepal's Maoist Insurgency. and also Gender and Social Inclusion in Nepal, an update, and most recently, editor of Two Steps Forward, One Step Back, the Nepal Peace Process. Social Science Baha, where Dr. Jivan Banya, who joins us today, is a researcher, and Mr. Thapa directs, is an independent, non-profit organization set up with the objective of promoting and enhancing the study and research in the social sciences in Nepal. Established 15 years ago now, with the primary focus of starting a library, the Baha now hosts lectures, discussions, workshops and conferences, has a hugely active publication wing through books and journals and occasional papers, and is engaged in the production and generation of primary research. For those who don't know Baha's work, I think it's fair to point out that this organization in 15 short years has had a profound impact on the research landscape in Nepal and also supporting and generating lasting capacity in the intellectual climate of research across the nation. We're also very fortunate this evening to be joined by Catherine Rankin, Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Dr. Rankin is the author of The Cultural Politics of Markets, Economic Liberalization and the Challenge for Social Planning in Nepal. She's also the principal investigator of a major 5-year research project funded once again by SSHRC entitled Infrastructures of Democracy, State Building as Everyday Practice in Nepal's Agrarian Districts. Professor Rankin has kindly agreed to serve as discussant following Mr. Thapa's presentation. Finally, and as if that were not enough, we have the distinct pleasure and privilege of the presence of the Honorable Hiranyalal Shrestha, who I gather is on his way right now to join this evening. Mr. Shrestha is a former member of Nepal's parliament. Originally from Makwanpur district, just south of Kathmandu, Mr. Shrestha is a writer, a journalist and a teacher who's also served as ambassador of the then Kingdom of Nepal to the Russian Federation in 2005 to 2006. Mr. Shrestha is currently president of the Nepal-Canada Friendship and Cultural Association, and he's kindly offered to give a brief vote of thanks, dui sabda, as we say in Nepali, which more or less equivalates to 5 minutes in English, a little vote of thanks at the end of this evening's program. And I would be remiss if I did not mention this whole weekend is just suffused with Nepaliness, because tomorrow the Nepal-Canada Friendship and Cultural Association is hosting its inaugural ceremony at the Surrey City Hall in the presence of the Ambassador of Nepal, also the former Ambassador to Russia from Nepal, Mr. Shrestha, and various ministers of provincial and federal level in Canada. With that, I thank all of you for your attention, and Deepak, the floor is yours. Oh, and you need this.
Yes. Thank you, Mike, for that very generous introduction to both myself and the organization that I represent. Distinct pleasure, obviously, to be here speaking in front of you on something that I have looked at quite closely over the years, and I hope what I can share with you will certainly provide some insights into the political situation that we're faced with. When I was asked to provide a title for the talk, I wanted to avoid the term transition. As one of the participants in the workshop in the afternoon mentioned, he does not like the term, but I don't like the term for other reasons. One is it's because it's been overstretched. It's been used for 10 long years, 10 and more years, a lot, and almost to lose meaning. But what a transition it has been. The most important transition we've seen in Nepal's modern era. Much more important than what we experienced in 1951, definitely. 1951 might have provided the grounds for this transition to have taken place. But imagine, we have a president who is a woman. she heads the country in place of a divine king. Now, something that would not have been even imaginable 12 years ago. But that's what we have. We have a transition in which we've had peaceful transfers of power numerous times, including from and to a group that still had its own private army. Now, that's something that's wonderful, and that is, I think, one of the most remarkable aspects of our transition. We threw out a king. We didn't cut off his head. We asked him to leave, and he left peacefully. He's still around. He's given the status of a former head of state. Now, that's a wonderful transition. And I think that's why, this transition is something to be celebrated. I mean, it's an overused term. But the transition is coming to an end. And that's why the subtitle mentions end in sight with a question mark, because we're not sure. It is coming to an end in terms of institutions. We've had one election, we're having 2 more elections, and that's when the constitution will have formally been enacted. We'll have a new power structure at the provincial, at the federal, provincial, and local level, and we will go into a new beginning. But does that mean transition ends? We're not sure, because there are so many imponderables waiting for us. So that's where it started. This is the scene in 2006 April around the ring road in Kathmandu. The massive demonstrations, the most vigorous demonstrations Nepal has ever experienced or witnessed, which led to the final capitulation of the king, monarchy, and the beginning of the transition. Hence, I thought it might be appropriate to start the presentation, or at least the initial slide, with a picture that reminds us of how the transition actually began. That led to this, a bunch of leaders who are celebrating the success that was bestowed on them by the people. And then this, the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accord 6 months later, and the actual beginning of the formal transition period. But the background starts a long time ago. It starts in 1951 when the Rana regime was overthrown, and that led to the power being transferred from the Ranas to the Shahs. Not much changed materially or politically or socially for the rest of the people. There was a peaceful transfer of, almost peaceful, transfer of power from the Ranas to the Shahs. That was the change. But what it also did was it opened up the space slightly for some time for peaceful organizing by various groups of people, and that's what led to the possibility that we saw in 2006. The Constituent Assembly was promised by the king, who was restored to power, but it never took place. We had political parties which were still trying to understand how it is that they function as political parties. They had not functioned as political parties before, so we really did not know who was more powerful, who was less powerful. Everyone claimed that they had the support of the people, but since there had been no electoral test, no one knew. And of course that led to, in 1954, the ascension of a very ambitious king who decided that he could very well do without the parties, and took over in 1960. But at least at that time, there was some organizing going on by the various groups that after 2006 or prior to 2006, we recognized increasingly as the groups that had been excluded by the polity for centuries at the very least. Of course, the 4 categories of women, Madhesis, Dalits and Janjatis, they began organizing in the 1950s. Madhesis were not known as Madhesis. Dalits had still not yet appropriated the term Dalits. Janjatis, of course, were not known as Janjatis then. But they had begun organizing in support of their own rights. But the Panchayat years put a stop to everything. There were no political activities allowed, and of course no kind of no organizing around your group identity either, because by decree we were all Nepalis and nothing more. So no organizing was allowed. Of course, that did not stop people from celebrating their own identities, because there was no way that you could forget the many centuries of differences, a differentiation that was perpetuated by the state. And just because the polity decided that you don't have other identities apart from your Nepali identity does not mean that you forget your identity. They all began organizing, but mainly as cultural organizations. This has all been dealt with by people who know much more about these things than me. So it was basically the Dalits and the Janjatis who organized as cultural organizations, but under the garb of being social welfare, social reform organizations. Mainly with Janjatis, they talked about how, there's a lot of drinking culture going on, they don't go to school, and so you got to change that. So Dalits also similar problems. And later Madhesis also began organizing in 1980s under the what was called the Sadbhavana Parishad. There was no political agenda as such, or at least stated political agenda. But what happens in 1990? As soon as 1990 happens and there's a second coming of democracy, all these groups that were cultural organizations suddenly become political, because they always had a political agenda somewhere hidden. But it also so happened that between 1960 and 1990, despite all the shortcomings of the panchayat system, it had a modernizing agenda. And as a modernizing state or a polity, one of the things that it had to do was expand education to large groups of the population. As a result of which, people were more aware of democracy and their rights by the time 1990 came along, which also led to much heightened sense of expectations from the political parties when they came to power. And it was believed that the restoration of democracy for the second time would be a panacea for all the ills that had beset Nepal for centuries. There are seats in the front. Please. Okay. But even as that happened, a very extreme strand of the Maoists, because we had a spectrum of Maoist parties in Nepal which still had not accepted fully the transition in 1990. So one of the more extreme strands began the People's War, believing that that was the way to change Nepali society. Obviously, there have been a lot of speculation on whether that was the full intent or that was meant to go on only for some time before they came to the mainstream. But the dramatic success of the Maoists, which they themselves certainly had not foreseen, changed Nepali society beyond recognition. But what they certainly did was they eroded democratic institutions, mainly through the process of liquidating class enemies to some extent. What it also did was inadvertently made it easier for the king to take over in 2002 and gradually in 2004 also, 2005. But what the king's takeover did was it led to the parties and the Maoists to come together, to work together, to fight against the king. And that was what we saw of in 2006. So towards new Nepal, these are scenes from the first day of the Constituent Assembly. And this would look more like a cultural program previous to 2006 that day. I mean, these are photographs that I love, because this represents the new Nepal. You see all kinds. You see the lady out there who looks a very sophisticated lady, the current Prime Minister's mother-in-law, now ambassador to Japan, I think. And then look at the ladies behind her. They come from obviously very different class backgrounds. But this is what Nepal was in 2008. This lady here, currently the speaker on the first day of the Constituent Assembly, signing up as the member of the CA. Contrast that with this. These are the three ministers who recently got inducted. They're squeezing, I don't know why they couldn't sign their names one after the other. They had to squeeze into this small bench. But this is what you would have seen in national legislatures and any national bodies prior to 2006 instead of this. So this is the change towards a new Nepal, which led to, again in May, the first sitting of the House declaring Nepal to be a republic. And like most things in Nepal, elections, celebrations, it's a carnival affair. There was a lot of tension prior to that, but certainly a lot of jubilation also. And the king, apart from the fact that it's a rather unfortunate choice of decorations for someone who believes in conservation, to have stuffed animals in the palace. This is his last day at the palace. He held a press conference, and you can see the inset. And he held a press conference, and he walked out with his family. I mean, that is, again, as I mentioned, a wonderful thing. This is the swearing in of the president and the vice president, something that was not imaginable. The vice president wearing a dhoti and a kurta, for which he was castigated loudly, particularly by the UML. They are not looking at this lady, but this is, again, a symbol of a new Nepal. A Muslim woman minister. We never had Muslim women in the parliament. We have a minister. That again, an expression of a new Nepal. But of course, 2006 and thereafter also led to an explosion of expectations and demands, because everyone believed that the new Nepal was around the corner. Of course, new Nepal was interpreted differently by different people. What did it mean? It did not mean, no one came and said, this is a new Nepal. New Nepal basically meant that everyone's voices, everyone's aspirations was going to be met by the state that was going to be created in a new Nepal. So that's when the negotiations start. So you have the Dalit professionals demanding reservations. You have the Tharus, the Magars, the Tamangs, and this little girl who comes from a mixed parentage, Newar and Dalit parentage, discriminated against by her the father's side, standing in a procession, seeking justice for herself. That is what we saw. And we also saw this. This was a reaction to the kind of demands that were being made by this group, mainly marginalized groups, and then by groups from the dominant community, who felt that any rights given to the marginalized groups would mean a negation of their own rights. So you find the Brahmin Samaj saying things like, we are also indigenous to Nepal. But of course, what we forget in all these debates and discussions is this group of people, the people who are mostly affected by the conflict. These are the photographs of the people who had disappeared that was put up in Basantpur. And again, one of the periodic demonstrations by the families of the disappeared, seeking justice for themselves. So what did we see after 2006? I think the most important thing was the rise of the Madhesi parties. A new force came into Nepal's political sphere. Again, there was so many expectations from the Constituent Assembly that had been elected. The most diverse Constituent Assembly, the most diverse national legislature Nepal has ever seen. Wonderful sight to see this diversity. So hence, obviously there was a lot of expectations. But there was also the issue of the Maoist army, the People's Liberation Army, that stayed in camps. So that sort of muddied the water for a long time, because there could not be clear-cut understanding until something was done with the Maoist army. It took 3 years before they were finally disbanded. But the main problem was obviously the question of federalism and the issue of how we're going to federalize the state. I'll come to that slightly later. And then we saw in 2013 the Constituent Assembly Part 2, and the return of consensus politics, because consensus was missing in the first Constituent Assembly. There was consensus on many fronts, but on the constitution and the political developments, there was no consensus in the first Constituent Assembly. The second one, certainly there was. But this was also heralded as a rejection of what is now called identity politics in Nepal. Now, identity politics is understood again very differently by different groups of people. I'll not go into what my own definition is, but certainly it was seen as that. But what I do want to emphasize is that if you look at it carefully, it seems more a rejection of the incumbents being the Maoist parties and the Madhesis, who were very strong at that time in the first Constituent Assembly. So it was more rejection of incumbents who were not able to either deliver a constitution or deliver services to the people. And that's a natural reaction that you find, anti-incumbency. But it was viewed as a rejection of identity politics, and I'll come to that later also. Of course, by that time, the Maoists had also split, and like all good communists, begging your pardon, Honorable Minister, Honorable MP, like all good communists, the most hated group of the split faction is the one that just split away from. So the two communist, the two Maoist factions did not see eye to eye, and the one that had split away from the main Communist Party, a main Maoist party, did all in its power to ensure the defeat of the major faction of the Maoist party, as has happened it happened in 1998 with the UML itself. So we saw, as a result, there was no agreement. Then we saw the earthquake and the political consensus. I'm moving faster because I want to go to the major point that I want to make at a later stage, because these are things that I don't need to repeat. We all know. We had the earthquake, and that led to some kind of political understanding because it was seen as a crisis, although it affected only 14 districts and 14 districts severely and 35 out of the 70 districts, because it also involved Kathmandu, and everything happens around Kathmandu. It was assumed that all of Nepal had been affected. It certainly had not been. There was half the country that had not been affected. So there was this imperative to come to an understanding so that they could build the country together. That has not happened. That's something else. So the new constitution adoption in 2015 September, and prior to that, led to the third Madheis movement that saw the killing of at least 50 people and atrocities by the state on an unimaginable scale. But the constitution was adopted. Then we saw the blockade, the failure of the blockade also, and some kind of accommodation with India. And then we've had elections after elections. So I just want to go back to the question of the new Nepal and where we are. A new Nepal was meant to be, of course, a better governed Nepal, but also was meant to be a more inclusive Nepal. That is what everyone fighting for their own space meant. Everyone wanted a space in the polity that constituted Nepal. And we did certainly make some very important strides towards the creation of a more just society in Nepal. 2006-2007, I guess, is the most progressive period of our political history, because there seemed to be a genuine desire from all the political parties and the people to create a new compact between the state and society, which also included recognizing that there are certain groups that have been marginalized over the centuries. It's not something that happened in 2006. There is a large body of discourse, and I'd like to point out this is a publication that came out in May. It's available online, and if you do 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you will be able to find this. But here I have an article in that where I've laid out where this whole inclusion agenda, at least after 1990, came from, and it was not something that came after 2006. It has a long pedigree. I mean, like if you can go back to the early 1900s when the women's movement started, and then the first stirrings of the movements, Janjati movements in the 1930s and 40s, and of course the 50s, 60 to 90 nothing happened, but then after the 90s, you know, it has a long history, long legacy of movement. So that was being recognized for the first time in 2006. So how did they do that? Of course, first thing was the parliament that met reduced the powers of the king to zero, absolute zero. We adopted secularism. I think one of the most progressive steps the Nepali state has taken. We adopted various acts, the most important being the, we call it the Gender Equality Act, but the actual name is Act to Amend Some Nepal Acts for Maintaining Gender Equality, which basically was an act that said that we will amend all the other acts that does not give gender parity by law. Very wonderful step. We had the Comprehensive Peace Accord and the Interim Constitution complementing each other in terms of its progressiveness, in terms of state restructuring and the granting of rights to various groups. And soon after that, federalism was also incorporated in the Constitution to be one of the defining principles of the state. Around the same time, the ILO 169 on indigenous groups and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in September 2007, 10 years ago, September 2007 happened. Around the same time, the Civil Service Act was amended to allow for quotas for different groups of people, something that had been talked about previously by various governments before 2006, but then after 2006 that was also amended. Of course, we had the new national anthem, who can forget that? An anthem that celebrated Nepal and not the king. Wonderful thing. We had the CA Election Act, which also introduced quotas. Now, I'll talk about that slightly later, about the impact of the quotas. And then, of course, we had the election of the first CA and the very diversity of Nepal being reflected in the first CA, which also led to the declaration of Nepal as a republic and finally got rid of the king. And I think very importantly, and this is something that is happening under the radar because these are not things that get much traction politically, is this whole inclusion agenda that has gradually been adopted by the state. There have been some reverses, but mainly because of the recognition by certain individuals and parties in the government, as well as the donors. The issue of gender and social inclusion has been integrated into the legal landscape of Nepal in various ways. And that is something that has been given the name gender equality and social inclusion to privilege gender over social inclusion because much of Nepal is still run by groups who are not too keen on social inclusion. So gender has been privileged over social inclusion, and most of the policies that have been enacted deal with gender inclusion more than social inclusion. But then because the very fact that there is social inclusion in that policy, policies that have been enacted by various government departments, social inclusion is certainly a major factor. But since the 2006-2007 period, we haven't had many progressive policies. I can think of only two notable pieces of legislation that reflect the idea of a new Nepal. The one is the Domestic Violence Act, where domestic violence was criminalized, and the other was the Caste-Based or Anti-Caste Discrimination Act. The first was in 2009, and the second was in 2011. So those are very progressive pieces of legislation we saw after that initial spurt of very progressive policies in the 2006-07 period. So there are various reasons that happened, but one of the reasons was that the Maoists, when they came to power, they began to be pulled to the right, which naturally happens to any revolutionary party that joins the mainstream. They cannot remain revolutionary anymore. We have seen that with the UML in 1990, and we saw that with the Maoists in 2006. They were pulled to the right. But then it seems that they were pulled too far to the right. It took the space that took the UML almost 20 years to reach, they managed to do that in 2 or 3 years. And that was a bit too fast, even for their own cadre, who revolted against them and decided to set up a new party. And of course, realizing that they do have to go to the right, most of them came back to this rightist or slightly rightist party, but that happened at a later date. But also, I think the more important fact in the Maoist shift to the right was the sudden influence of people who really had not invested so much in the People's War and did not really believe in what the People's War stood for. And there are a lot of variations of opinion on what the People's War did or did not do. But there's no denying the fact that if the Maoists had not launched that war, the great transformation that we saw in 2006 and 7 would never have happened. Would have happened maybe 50 years later, maybe never. But it happened within 10 years. So there were those people, who were brought into the party at a later stage after 2006 in order to make the party larger, to increase their organizational base. Of course, there was this initial period in the early 2000s when they brought in all kinds of people into the party, including criminal elements. After 2006, even more of these people came in. And I think and there are so many different indications, but there's a recent news item of a current head of rural municipality from Sindhu Palchok, who is under hiding, who was elected on a Maoist ticket, who is under hiding because he's being sought by the police for smuggling gold, 7 kilos of gold. So you can imagine what kind of people actually enter the Maoist party and what kind of commitment they would have to the ideals that the committed cadre had, and for which they were ready to give their lives. For those of us who went out into the field at the time and met these cadre, and they were really committed, and it sounded pretty silly, but but the kind of commitment they had, you could never doubt the level of commitment. Of course, the main problem was, as I mentioned, the issue of federalism, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I arrived the day before yesterday and had gone to a talk with Mark downtown, and Professor Lightfoot, right, that's her name. Professor Lightfoot made an observation which struck me as being very pertinent to what I'm going to talk about. She talked about her grandmother, who said that a compromise is won when everyone walks away unhappy. If there's anyone who walks away happy, then that's not a compromise. I think the problem with federalism was something of that kind, that there were people who thought that they should be happy, and there were people who thought that they should be unhappy. And I think that's where the main problem is. There was there's very rigid stances that we saw after 2007 when federalism was included in the constitution, and then the various contours of the federalism were being debated. And particularly, I would blame the Janjatis and the Madhesis for believing that they have the upper hand, they have the numbers, and they would be able to force everyone else to follow the agenda of what kind of federalism that they wanted. In May 2012, just before the dissolution of the first Constituent Assembly, a proposal had been made for an 11-province federal Nepal that was rejected outright by the Janjati groups and the Madhesi groups, believing that they could get a better deal. That was the main problem. They thought that just because of their numbers, they would be able to do or impose their idea of federalism or their idea of a federal structure on the rest of the country. I think what they feared was that they failed to understand that there was a genuine fear among the dominant groups who felt that they were going to lose power. And it's not only a fear that comes out of any group that is on the verge of losing power, but then it was more than that. There was issues like the kind of discourses that were being peddled at that time, such as the question of priority rights, that the titular groups of a particular region would have prior rights over natural resources, over the chief executive, that kind of thing. You all know what I mean. The problem obviously was that there were a range of positions that were being articulated by a range of people. But in a situation like this, obviously only the hardline position gets highlighted on both sides. You don't get the moderates being highlighted. So you get the hardline positions on both sides being highlighted, and hence the issue of federalism was seen as something that was not palatable to the dominant groups. Particularly the question of what is now called ethnic federalism or ethno-federalism. But then dominant groups were not dominant without reason. They're dominant because they're dominant. They control everything. They control the parties to begin with. They control the bureaucracy. They control the media. They control civil society. What don't they control? They control everything. Maybe business, maybe not so much, because Marwaris control most of Nepali businesses. But there too, they're coming in a very strong way. So they're dominant for a reason. And that is something that Madhesis and Janjatis fail to understand. You don't piss off a dominant group and expect to get away with that without compromises. So there were very uncompromising voices being heard from the Tarai saying one province, one Tarai, one province, and then all kinds of ethnic federalism, federal ideas in the hills. So dominant groups got a way to get back. And hence, we saw various attempts being made by groups that were in power all the time. Most prominent example that has been talked about is, there's something that I've written about, and maybe like some of you may not know. There's something called the United Nations Development Assistance Framework that was drafted in 2012. That's something that UNDP does along with the National Planning Commission as a government document under which, that's the framework under which development assistance is supposed to take place from the UN system, and which often is followed by the smaller agencies, which, unlike DFID and USAID, which have their own agenda, but the smaller donors follow that. Now, when the UNDAF, UNDAF, was drafted, that was sent to the National Planning Commission for their comments. And the comments came back with all references to marginalization, exclusion, Janjatis, dominance, all of that deleted, including they not only edited out these references, they even edited the comprehensive peace accord, extracts of the comprehensive peace accord that were cited in the document, an accord that had been reached in 2006. So, you can imagine this guy, this bureaucrat who's so angry at all this, deleting a document that was signed in 2006, 6 years later. How can you edit a document that was signed in 2006? But just to give an example, that no one wanted to hear this whole issue of inclusion, because the debate on federalism had taken on such negative tones that inclusion and federalism became one and the same. Another example that I can give you was a friend of mine who works for a development agency had gone to meet the top bureaucrat at the Ministry of Federal Affairs and Local Development, Mofald, and talked about, so what are you going to do? Federalism is going to come. And this guy said, don't talk about federalism. I don't want to talk about federalism. And, my friend said, but you are the secretary of something called the Ministry of Federal Affairs and Local Development. That was the kind of atmosphere in the 2012-13 period, because of this very uncompromising stand taken. I would certainly blame Janjatis and Madhesis for, compromise. Everyone should be unhappy. I think like in 2006 and 2007, there was the sense that, it's only Janjatis and Madhesis who are going to be happy from this compact. But just to give you an idea of where we were on the federalism agenda, again, federalism agenda also seen as something that came out after 2006. This is the administrative divisions of Nepal Tarai Congress, we do not know much about it except what I referred to particularly in two books, Leo Rose's book and Frederick Gage's book. We find that there is a reference to the Nepali Tarai Congress demanding that the Tarai be a separate regional province. That's all we know. So this is based on the assumption that Tarai, by the Tarai they mean the 20 districts that is currently in the Tarai. This is very interesting. In 1991, the Nepal Sadhvana Party, and in 1991, when there were a whole lot of other, what I call proto-ethnic parties that had been formed, they withered away. But there were all kinds of proposals being floated about, what kind of provinces we should have in Nepal. Most of the literature is lost, but this is from their manifesto, which is partly written in Hindi. And there they advocate this form of federalism. And imagine this is something that if it had been given in 1991, if there had been any serious discussion about this in 1991, a whole lot of things would have changed. Because this is what they wanted, two Tarai provinces and 3 provinces on top. But of course, no one was willing to listen to it. Things change slightly because I think one has to point out his surname. He's not a Janjati, he's not a Madhesi. He's a Hill Bahun. And he was one of the first people from the marginalized groups who started talking about this issue of ethno-federal states. So this is from his book, the Nepalma Jatiya Prashna. Then came this bombshell of an announcement in 2004. Govinda Neopane's book was just a book. Some of us read. It was widely circulated, and it is still very widely cited in academic circles. But then it did not have the impact that this did. Autonomous regions that were declared by the Maoist Party in 2004, where for the first time they gave a conception of what they thought the autonomous regions should look like. I'd shown this map in 2005 in Cornell, making a presentation, and of course, one of the audience members says, "What about us? Where is our province?" So I said, maybe like Beri Karnali or Seti Mahakali. But after 2007, people started really seriously thinking about, what kind of federalism we should have. So this is the conception of federalism by the 2 Madhesi parties. For them, they're not really interested in what happens out here. All they want is this, which is rather unfortunate as well, because if you are a party of Nepal claiming to have national aspirations, then you should be aware of what happens up there. It's not one thing out there. Like whatever happens up there, it doesn't matter. So long as you get that. But then, of course, it's true for other groups. Like this is the proposed Magarat, from the Nepal Magar Sangh. East Magarat and West Magarat. These are aspirations only, obviously. But again, there are various proposals. There must have been. We published a book. We had around 70, but there were certainly more than these proposals. Again, it's very interesting. You look at the surnames. A lawyer, Chandrakanta Giwali, and the other one is Mangal Siddhi Manandar, who used to be with Indian Party, but later left. He's a geographer as well, so he has a team of geographers working with him. And his conception of what a federal Nepal should look like is defined by his ethnicity, and his conception is defined by his own ethnicity. It's very interesting. By that time, of course, the Maoists had also decided that they want another go at how they want to divide up the country. This is the previous one. This is what they want. This was the manifesto in 2008, sorry. Then we had this. We had the Constituent Assembly, the State Restructuring Committee, came up with this idea of 14 provinces. That was not acceptable. So we went for a State Restructuring Commission in 2012. So the State Restructuring Commission had 9 people in it. And 4 belonged to the dominant groups and 5 belonged to the marginalized groups. So by majority vote, this was passed. An idea, again, which is very similar to ethno-federal provinces. But the minority group of 4 people said, no, 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 that was approved by majority, but we would like to present our own idea of what federal Nepal should look like. So this is a 6 province model presented by the minority group, which is very similar, if you look at these two, quite similar to what was agreed by the parties in August 2015, with the difference being that these districts in the hills were made part of the Tarai province, or the districts in the Tarai were made part of the hill province. But the major point of contention was that the western part was all made into one big province. And protests happened, and within days they had changed the boundaries to make it a 7-province nation, with the western part divided into two parts. And this is what had been proposed in November 2016, following the Madhesh movement and the compromises that had been reached partly with India and partly with the Madhesi parties. This was what had been proposed. We held a vote only recently and was defeated, obviously, because to change the constitution you need a 2/3 majority, and the Congress and the Madhesis and the Maoists do not have a 2/3 majority. But as promised by Sherbahadur Deuba again, if they win the majority, they will go for this. So we're going to have either this or this as the future Nepal. The most prominent factor after 2006 has been how social movements have become so powerful. Yes, there has been talk about how identity politics has taken a back seat, but I don't think it has taken a back seat. I think people are just sick and tired right now with politics, because things are not going anywhere. But things, like it has often been said about conflicts in heterogeneous societies. If you become too rich, there's conflict. If you become too poor, there's conflict. So either way, there's going to be conflict, unless you can find the right balance to manage all the communities together. So women, Dalit, Janjatis and Madhesis have proved very effective. Madhesis much more effective by virtue of the concentration in a particular part of Nepal, and by virtue of the fact that they control access to the hills from India. But there's too many fault lines also. The women, there's this discussion this afternoon about, there's a scholar in Nepal, Krishna Bhattachan, who claims that Janjatis are very egalitarian in terms of gender relations. He's written about it, he speaks about it all the time. And one of our researchers showed a photograph of a village meeting in Mustan. They were not Thakalis, but they were Janjatis anyway, where women were consciously prohibited from attending that meeting. So women, regardless of their ethnicity, have been looked down by men all the time. So there is this divide. And when you had this great debate on the constitution, when the constitution was being adopted, about the curtailing of women's rights, women's right to pass on citizenship, and that's something that I forgot to mention in the list of progressive policies, the Citizenship Act of 2007. The men were not there. There were no Dalits outside, there's no Janjati, there were no Madhesis. They were siding, they became all men. You don't give rights to women. And then when the fault line between Dalits and Janjatis and Madhesis, it's also there. The fault line with the dominant groups is always there. But then, for instance, when an atrocity against a Dalit is committed, you never find Janjatis protesting, demanding that, if Janjatis claim that it is not their culture, then they should be out there with the Dalits fighting. They never do that. And of course, I think one of the major realignments that has taken place after 2015 and the blockade that we saw was that despite all the differences, all the Pahadis became one. So Dalits, Janjatis, Bawan Chetri, everyone saw Madhesis and India as the enemy. And that is, of course, due to the fact that there were material difficulties that they were facing, but they also felt the insecurity of what would happen if the Tarai were to, something were to happen to the Tarai. So that was a very important factor in this seeming rapprochement among the Pahadi groups, who are obviously in a very dominant majority. But what does it mean for now? Not all has been lost. The inclusion agenda is being slowly watered down in various places, but it's here to stay. No one is going to be able to get rid of this idea of a quota system. It's not the best way of ensuring inclusion, but that's the only thing that we know how to do because we learned it from India. That's what they do it in India, so we might as well do it here as well. We don't have what is called positive discrimination. We have a quota system. We don't have positive discrimination. We have some amount of that. Scholarships to Dalits and scholarships to endangered, marginalized groups, scholarships to girls. So in a sense, yes, there is some amount of that, but mostly inclusion is affected through quotas, which has its own problems. But then election of this very diverse group also means empowerment, because quotas are ensured in all levels of election, including the local levels. And empowerment, we're seeing examples of what this empowerment does. The most recent examples are the decisions by Kathmandu, Lalitpur and Kirtipur to adopt Newari as another language of official business, something that was outlawed or that was declared illegal by the Supreme Court in 1998. 20 years later, the local governments have the authority to say, okay, they're going to use that. We're going to see more of that in province number 2, where Maithili and Bhojpuri is going to be increasingly used as a second language of official business. Again, I say, there was a tendency in 1998 to describe that as replacement of Nepali by Newari or Maithili, which was never the case. It was Nepali and Newari, Nepali and Maithili. But the mainstream media has its way of twisting things and creating that impression that Nepali is being replaced. It is never. It's not going to be replaced. The fact is that despite the fact that the census shows that only 48% of the population speak Nepali as a mother tongue, it has a political meaning to that also. Most people do speak Nepali. So the other thing that we are seeing now is the name changes. There was a news item today in which 21 rural municipalities, Gaon Palikas, have proposed changing their names and or the headquarters or the centers. But I think this came out only today, so I do not know the full details. But what has happened in the past is in Udaipur, this was the first one, there's something called the Sunkosi Gaon Palika, Sunkosi Rural Municipality, decided to change its name to Lingchungbong Rural Municipality, Lingchungbong Gaon Palika. So you can see the change. More recently, in Rasua, Parvati Kund was changed to Ama Chodingmo municipality, a rural municipality. So this is where Ama Chodingmo is. So this is Rasua, and that's, who thought of this name Parvati Kund? A place like that, that does not sound like Parvati Kund. It sounds like Chodingmo. And as I just did a Wikipedia search, and I found out that the name Chodingmo was changed to Parvati Kund in the 1990s. There was a 40 saal. So it was very recent that it was changed. Why would they do that? And the interesting thing is, the Rural Municipal Council of that Gaon Palika has 27 members. 10 of them are UML. So it's not entirely, like some Janjati party. All but the 5 mandatory Dalit women are Tamangs. everyone is a Tamang, 22 Tamangs and 5, because there has to be a representation from Dalit women in the 5 different wards. So, the chairperson's explanation was, everyone calls it Chodingmo, so we changed it to Chodingmo. So, what I'm arguing is that, there are various forms of identity assertion that is happening, that will happen. It does not necessarily mean that, it will be of the kind that we saw in the past. And this also is good because it allows for various groups to feel that they are part of state, the polity, and that there is recognition. And imagine having to live in Parvati Kund. You're a Tamang, you don't speak any other language. But living in Chodingmo makes a lot of sense. There is, of course, the flip side is that social identity will become stronger, but then that will obviously be the case when you have quota systems. There was this move from among Dalits to change the names, but then that is no longer the case. Being a Dalit is no longer seen as only stigma. Being a Dalit also means having an opportunity. There are certain seats reserved for you. So social boundaries, which everyone hopes will wither away, is not going to happen because it makes sense to be part of a particular group because there are incentives. And because the public sector is still the largest employer in Nepal, and this of course includes the army and the police, army and the security forces, there is a great incentive to continue to cling to your identities and further reinforce, they get this sense of reinforcement from each other. One of the arguments against this reification of caste and ethnic identity is that it will make people feel less of a Nepali and more of your own caste and ethnic identity. The counter argument obviously is that when has it ever been the case that being a Nepali meant more than your caste or ethnic identity? Caste and ethnic identity was always the organizing principle of the Nepali state. Until 1963, I was born in 1964. Until 1963, there was the old Muliki Ain, although not actually in practice. In law, by law, it was still there. So, if in the 40s, if Mark had committed a crime and I had committed the same crime, Mark, by virtue of being a mlecha, would be certainly punished to a higher degree. Probably would not, because you're a British, so the British resident would take you out. But certainly, like the punishment that I would receive compared to other people here in this room would be much higher because of my own identity. So we cannot forget that was, in practice until 50 years ago. We see, the case of Parvati Kund. I mean, just 80s, like just a few years ago. That's what happened. And who can forget the attempt by people from the Baun Kshetri community trying to make Sanskrit compulsory until grade 10. I mean, including, well-known, just out of the bush communist revolutionaries, people who became prime ministers later on. They were the ones who were advocating the imposition of Sanskrit, despite the fact that a large number of people don't understand it as a medium of instruction. So this is very problematic. So of course there is even stronger incentive to claim one's ethnic identity. Under the new Election Act, 40% of the seats are under the proportional representation system, and everything has been neatly divided into your caste or ethnic identities. So if I want to stand for the PR part of the election and say I'm just a Nepali, no way. I have to belong to one of those 6 categories of people. You just can't be a Nepali and stand for election. You have to identify with one or the other group. But on the other hand, you see, like, for the first time, Muslims have been recognized as a group deserving reservations under that category. Muslims receive only one mention in the interim constitution. So there has been a great change. We have a Muslim commission, whatever it will do is something else, but at least we have recognition of a national Muslim commission. And they've been given reserved quotas in the PR part of the election. I would just say that, the scholar Perry Anderson talking about India, he wrote a piece before Modi's election. So it's somewhat negated by what has happened, but then Modi's election is only one election. We need to see what happens further down the line. But his view was that, after the Mandal Commission's report was implemented and the rise of the other backward classes, and of course we had the scheduled castes already organized, you see a reconfiguration of politics in the Hindi heartland, where Congress is out of the scene. Congress will probably never come back to power again. But what you see is the rise of these various groups of hitherto unknown or unimagined groups of people who are in power. And his argument is that, the state might not be better, but at least it is more representative. And because it is representative, the Indian state has become more stable. That is his argument. And I think that might hold to some extent for Nepal as well in the future. Because the state has never delivered. The state never delivered in India. It has never delivered in Nepal. The Ranas obviously ran a very extractive state. The Panchayat was also extractive in a different sort of way, culturally extractive. Birendra Bir Vikram Shah was only slogans. He gave us a number of slogans, but gave us nothing. The Nepali Congress, UML, and the RPP in the 1990s gave us nothing. They gave us the People's War and the Pajero scandal and various other things. Corruption was institutionalized to such an extent that it has come back. And that is what we're seeing with the new configuration of politics. The Congress, the UML, the Maoists, the Madhesis, the RPP, Imagine these three guys who are squeezing against each other to sign their ministerial appointments. They're going to be minister for only 2 months. And they've been minister before. It's not as if they've never been a minister. They've been minister so many times. They'll be ministers again and again. Why? Because it's all a question of patronage. So the deal makers. So here we have them, starting from this corner. Deputy Prime Minister, former Deputy Prime Minister, former Deputy Prime Minister, current Prime Minister, former Deputy Prime Minister, former 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 Prime Minister, dead Prime Minister now, and Deputy Prime Minister. The fact that they all belong to one gender is striking. But then they do these things all the time. They come up with agreements all the time, agreements that are only meant to be broken. The other two characters in this story obviously are these two, Girija and KP. So this is him being the Deputy Prime Minister for the first time in 2006. Despite the fact that he was so against the 2006 movement, he was the first one to benefit by being the Deputy Prime Minister and later on Prime Minister as well. So things have not changed much. So this is a book that we're publishing from Social Science Bahar that's coming out tomorrow. So this shows the composition of the cabinets since 1951, till this is Sushil Koirala. So this is the Khasarya, because we have to use the term now. That's the official term. Janjati, Madhesi, this one is Dalit, and this is Muslim. So things have not changed much, have they? If there is some change, it is in this column, Pushpa Kamal Dal, where Janjatis figure in large numbers. But then it comes at the cost of some other group. You don't have Dalits, you don't have Muslims. So things will not change, have not changed at the national level. So the point I was trying to make was that things will not change at the national level for a long time because of the way the party structure works. Yes, the parties have become more inclusive. All the parties have inclusive policies. There are quotas for different groups of people. But then quotas only take you up to a certain point. You really do not get to the apex bodies of these parties. So despite all the quotas, the Standing Committee of the UML does not, if I'm mistaken, there's only one non-bound Kshatriya man, not a woman, in the group. Central Working Committee of Congress, I don't know what they have. But it's not going to change. So what we can look forward to is changes that are happening at the local level. And the example that I gave of Parvati Kunda to Chodingmo was precisely that. So even if that were to happen, the state is not going to deliver. If we can see the state reflecting yourself, I think that will be a start. Delivery will happen by the by, if ever. And this is a photo I love, and I'm going to end with this. This is a photo that appeared in the PDNA. The PDNA is a wonderful piece of art, and this photo is in that. So I think this encapsulates the beauty of Nepal and the horror of 2015 April. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepak, for a talk that only you could give, strangely sobering and uplifting at the same time. With that, I'd like to hand over to Catherine Rankin, who's kindly offered to serve as discussant and moderator for a conversation. Okay. Yes, shall I?
So thank you. We're pushing up against the dinner hour, so I won't linger very long here, only long enough to say, Deepak, thank you for the gift of delivering us a political history of Nepal with a hopeful tone, right? For really laboring over a long period of time as a sort of calm, reasoned, public intellectual, right, for all of us, giving us a historicized understanding of political parties, of federalism, for also speaking truth to power in a way that not only holds accountable our long-standing elites, but also questions and challenges the counter-hegemonic forces for its or their shortcomings. So there's the balance in this analysis, which is much appreciated. You've also been a steady voice for inclusion, as well as an analyst of inclusion, and in the context of analysis, advocacy is all the more potent, I think. And then I just last say that I find it quite refreshing, actually, that, you ended up on a rather stark note, right? That, in fact, nothing's changed at the national scale when it comes to the some key aspects of demographics, right, in your last visual. But you deliver that message in the context of such, hopefulness and evidence of a longer-term trajectory toward progressive social change that we can all get behind, I think, and be hopeful about. So I won't take up time with my questions. I'll see if they might fit in a little bit later. As we move along, I'd really rather turn to you now, since there are so many of you, and ask if you have any questions or comments on the talk. And as I do that, I'm going to ask that you allow me to collect questions in groups so that Deepak can have an opportunity to integrate them, and also that you tell us your name and something very briefly about who you are. So that will help Deepak locate you, because it helps to know who you're talking to, right? Did you say you wanted me to do something with chairs? So I'll invite, go ahead.
Catherine, could I ask you perhaps also for those who are joining online, since we don't have a revolving mic, if you could perhaps repeat the question into the microphone so we can record it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now I carry this with me. Okay. So questions or comments? Go ahead.
My name is Kapil Redmi. I'm a recent graduate from UBC and I teach here now. Thank you very much for such a brilliant summary of the Nepal political history. I had read about your, but never seen you and then heard your voices. It was very nice for me to understand how the word transition itself has to be understood in the Nepalese context. And you very well started, as expected, from 1951. But what I found missing here is that, through your observation, it would be very helpful. What role do you see of the foreign forces that is so pervasive in the networks and media and so many things? And if you attend a meeting in Nepal, it dominates. But we shouldn't, I think, forget in this kind of forum what role the foreign forces like India, China, and if you call the US or USSR from 1951, what kind of role they have played in Nepal's transition.
Okay. I'm going to also mention that one of the other requests I have of you is that you make your questions brief, so that's why I jumped up in the middle of yours. But thank you. The question is, how do you account for the role of foreign forces in understanding the transition?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
My question is, given the current constitution...
Oh, could you please tell, for the wider group, your name? Yeah.
Do I need to stand as well?
Sure.
My name is Naresh Squarala. I'm an engineer by profession. I know nothing about politics, but I'm just happen to be one of the curious ones. So, given the current situation, Deepak, if you were to look at a crystal ball and tell us whether you see Nepal 5 years from now being trending towards economic development, good governance, and fulfilling democratic aspirations, at least towards that way as a trend. 5 years from now, look at the crystal ball and tell us.
Okay. Can I get one more? You choose.
My name is Chultan Guru. I'm from Mustan. And some years ago that I heard Nepal become a secular country. Yes. But in Nepali word is a Dharma Nirpaksha, right? That means that equal respect to all religions. So my question to you is there in the constitution, in Nepalese constitution, does that mean that all religions are equidistant with the politics, or include all religions in the politics?
Okay, so questions 2 and 3 are, do you see a trending toward economic development and good governance through all of this in Nepal? And secondly, how would you characterize secularism?
Let's start with the last one. Secularism, the practice of secularism in Nepal is dictated by what happens in India.
I'm going to interrupt you and give you the microphone.
The model of secularism in India is very different from what is practiced in other countries, including what is still being practiced in principle in Turkey. where the separation of the state with religion is very clear cut. In India, it is equidistance from all religions, but also support in proportion to their respective strengths. So hence the equidistance also means equinearness. So the Hindu religion obviously warrants much more support from the state, because the state supports all different religions. Nepal is the same. So in that sense, of course, the wording in the current constitution is rather unfortunate, which has come to mean that secularism means the practice of Hinduism in one interpretation of the term. But in general, that's, hopefully like that will not really change the conditions on the ground, where the state continues to provide protection to all religions, not only to be practiced, but also to propagate it. That's what freedom of religion is.
Thank you.
Not a very popular thing to say in Nepal, but that's secularism, and that's, I think, the most humane thing to follow. On the question of the crystal ball, I wish I didn't have to answer that. When the conflict was going on, you'd be asked this crystal ball questions all the time, and I would say anyone who says anything about that, whether to the yes or no or whatever it is a liar. No one actually knew in that context where the conflict was going. People certainly hazarded all kinds of opinions, but then these were just speculations, because no one really knows. But I guess one would like to say that nothing would change, because things have not changed, and the current lot of leaders are still the same lot we inherited from 1990. The same people, who made corruption such an art. Fortunately, there is, I think, a growing dissatisfaction within the people, that they are speaking out, and I think they might be being heard now. Who knows? There is a possibility that the media is going to continue to rake this issue to make it so uncomfortable. It's not going to really hurt them politically. If it would hurt them politically, many of these leaders would never be elected. But just to make it uncomfortable, the media is going to continue to hound them, to make them somewhat accountable to what is being talked about. All these scandals that are going on, at least there is some movement because of this pressure that they are feeling from the public, and the great effort that the media is putting. And there was this news item a week or so ago, where the major newspapers decided that they would join hands in this civic action against corruption. And these are people who really don't like each other, and they've come together because they feel that one, because it sells newspapers, but the other is it's an issue of very great importance as well. On the question of foreign forces in Nepal, foreign forces, there are two ways of looking at foreign forces. One is, of course, at the geopolitical level. At the geopolitical level, I guess, there's India, there's China, and there's India again, and there's the US, and there's India again, there's UK, there's India again. So you understand what I mean. On the other question that is often talked about when people talk about changes since 2007 is the role of foreign organizations in this whole social movement. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about the social movement after 1951 and before 1951 was to demonstrate that yes, it became easier for marginalized groups who don't have the resources to organize better through foreign funding that the governments said should go to them according to the various documents. The 9th plan, the 10th plan, all said, you should support marginalized groups, support them. And of course, when you support marginalized groups to be empowered people speak. And then when they speak, then you say, okay, it's your money, it's you who's responsible for them speaking out. That's what happened in the 2012 and after 2007. There are a whole lot of people who continue to believe that Nepali society was a very egalitarian society. We were all living very well. We didn't have any problems. These are very general characterizations that you find, which are very problematic because they're not true. Nepali society was never egalitarian.
Thank you.
Okay, I can take a couple of more. So we have exactly two hands. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take three more. Make your questions very succinct.
Me first.
Yeah.
I'm Suresh Vaidya from the Nepali community here in Vancouver. Another naive question. I understand they are holding an election for the provinces in the near future. If the number of provinces don't appear to have been quite formed, what would happen once after they have the election and they decide to change the number of provinces? How would the scenario go?
Number two? Did you have your hand up earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
My name is Pramod. I'm a doctoral student in language and literature education here, and that's the reason I have a question from language. As you said, there is a kind of fear among the dominant group that Nepali is being replaced or will be replaced by Maithili and Bhojpuri in the province too. So why do you think Nepali should not be replaced by Maithili and Bhojpuri? As well as Hindi is the most dominant language, or to say Hindi is, mostly spoken as a lingua franca in Madhes or province number 2. So how do you look at this issue that people are demanding for Hindi to be an official language, whereas the government as well as the people from North are very negative towards Hindi? So how do you look at this phenomenon?
And number three.
My name is Dhompa. I'm a graduate student in economics here, and I was wondering if you had anything to say about whether, voting reform, in the sense of the composition of the parliament that goes by first past the post versus proportional representation, whether that is still in the conversation, because that would potentially be a mitigating factor against haggling over these specific state boundaries, because if you have more seats in parliament that are going through proportional representation, it might not matter as much that a certain geographical area is in one province rather than the other.
Okay, so we have three questions. Two are about the elections. The first one is how will elections be handled when the new provinces come into being? I apologize if I'm messing up the questions as I restate them. I'm sure you heard them properly the first time. And the second election question is, what about first past the post elections as a way to mitigate the conflict over state boundaries? Sorry?
Let's go.
Sorry, yes, okay. And then the third question had to do with language politics in province number 2. And could you comment on that?
I'll go with Apurva's first again, because I might forget the answer that I'm formulating. The PR election has, the PR election at the federal level has nothing to do with the shape of the provincial boundaries. Because who goes to represent you at the federal level does not necessarily have an impact in terms of who gets to rule that province. That's an issue. But the other thing that one has to understand is that there is a lot of debated discussion, and of course it has been proven to some extent that the number of seats in the PR section, which has come down to 40 as opposed to 55 in the earlier parliament, earlier CA, will see a reduction in diversity that has been argued. But we should not forget that the diversity that is automatically guaranteed by the dominance of certain groups in certain parts of the country. There is this wonderful publication by Kare Valan, who has analyzed elections since 1990 to argue that there are certain groups of people who lose out, but not everyone does. And the dominant groups among the marginalized groups, marginalized communities, will always be represented more or less to their proportion. So that is something that is guaranteed. There will be certain groups that will lose out. Obviously, Dalits always lose out if you don't have a strong constituency for Dalits in the PR. So in that sense, the PR thing, it's very interesting that, when in November 8, the 7 parties met with the Maoists, they had this agreement that led to the CPA. There was a vote of dissent, a note of dissent written by the UML representative, who the basic thing is saying was, we need PR. The PR is the most democratic form of voting. So that was what they were pushing for. But now, obviously, UML is very much against PR for obvious reasons. But forgetting the fact that there are other configurations that happen as well. On the question of language, why is Hindi not adopted? If you ask me personally, I have no problem. I'm a private citizen. I argue the same thing. What's the problem with Hindi?
My question, sir, why
no. I'm coming to that. So your second question was also that. So why not Hindi? Why can't Hindi be one of the official languages? Like every other language, we have 100 and whatever number of languages, and Hindi could also be. Hindi has not been given recognition although there are Hindi speakers according to the census, it has not been given recognition of the kind that the other languages are given. It's obviously has to do with the India factor. But why not replace Nepali by Bhojpuri or Maithili? I think again, one has to look at province number 2 is not only the home of Maithili and Bhojpuri speaking people. There are people who speak Nepali as well. So when you become an inclusive polity, you have to be inclusive of everyone. So you can't include yourself and then exclude everyone else. So hence the formula of making these languages as well official in these bodies would make more sense, because there are a lot of people who don't understand Bhojpuri and Maithili in these provinces as well. So it makes greater sense to have as many languages as possible, and that has already happened in the court system. In the court system, I guess many people don't know because they've been doing it very quietly. You have a whole number of translators, interpreters in the courts, in the district courts. It started with Nuwakot, where they appointed a Tamang translator. So that has happened, but they're doing it quietly, without much fanfare. But it has happened. So, the language of the courts is Nepali, but they understand that people do not understand Nepali fully, so they've had translators. And it is happening in many parts of Nepal as well. So it has happened. So, making any language exclusive is not a very good idea. Then you become exclusionary yourself. Is there something else? Yeah, provincial boundaries. Yes, provincial boundaries, according to our law, it can be changed again and again and again and again. But the threshold that is required of the representatives is very high. So that's why they want to do it now, because it becomes easier. Later on, the threshold becomes higher. So just like the name change, for the first 6 months, you can change the name of your Gampalika and all of that. After that, it becomes, of course, it is possible, it is the people's will, but the process is much more complicated, much tougher.
Right. Thank you for your questions. I've given my thanks all around, and I pass it back to Mark to help us give our collective thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Deepak. And if we can please hold our own collective thanks and invite His Honourable Hiranyalal Shrestha, former ambassador, as I mentioned, to the to the Russian Federation from the then Kingdom of Nepal, who has kindly offered to share a few words as a vote of thanks as we move towards dinner. Perhaps I will also take this one moment to say, in keeping with local Kosalish tradition, but also Nepali tradition, we kindly ask that elders and out-of-town visitors please eat first before our students and our faculty vacuum up the remains. With that, Ambassador Shrestha. Thank you.
Thank you that you have given chance to share something with you in this evening. Listening almost half Thapa's lecture, it was quite comprehensive, impressive. And the questions you from floated, very interesting. I will supplement some things about this discussion. First, I will give total picture in short. Nepal is facing, the Himalaya is facing, both this below the surface, we are facing earthquakes. There is struggle, plate, Tibetan plate and Indian plate. So that will come again. But challenge is how to educate the people and to how to make damage less and to prepare. So in Nepali it is saying that Patal, below the surface there is conflict. On the Akash, in the atmosphere, we have conflict. We are in between two largest polluter of the world, that is China and India, in this process of utilization. So Himalayan snow is melting, outburst of this glaciers. At the same time, the malaria in upstairs. Now we are, there is malaria, normally in plains, but now in mountain also. So climate change is another serious. So Akash, Patal, and in surface, many problems. One of the important problems is Thapa dealt very comprehensively. In surface, there are two types of problems we have. External, that is, in old days, Cold War period, superpowers dominated two blocks. But now, superpowers, the old superpowers, their role is decreasing, and assertive China, India, and some BRICS countries, they are in forefront. The economic growth engines and political activities that is shifting from West to Asia. So Doklam, the recent happening, after that China became more active now in Southeast Asian region also. So that's the reasons. Just 3 days before Prime Minister's visit to India, Chinese minister was there in Kathmandu. So they became quite successful to neutralize Nepal on Doklam issue. In old days, it was India's security umbrella. India takes Nepal as their sphere of influence. But this time they felt too interesting. India tried to block joint military exercise with China, but they failed. So there was joint military exercise for the first time between Nepalese army and Indian army. Another, India tried to block Nepal to join BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, but Nepal signed it. So there is a new framework to deal with China, that is BRI framework. So these are the things. That means no possible of Bhutanization to Nepal. It is out of their old total grip. It's two reasons. One, China is second largest economy and military power. India is fifth one. If we take Indian side, we will be insecure. The bigger power we can't antagonize. So that is our reality. So our security lies in balance, equiproximity, and good relation with both the neighbors. In 62 border war, Nepal took same position, the neutrality. So it became not only relief for Nepal in those days, but it became a relief for India and China, that 500 miles, long mile, that became neutralized. They could not shed blood in that frontier. So it is good for both India and China, Nepal to be a neutral one. That is, so the first time India spoke, China spoke openly that if India enter in Doklam, if that is trijection, then your trijection, if you have your security concern, then if Nepal enter into Kalapani area, which is now occupied by India, what will be the consequences? They were asking to Indian media person when they asked. So after years of occupation by Indian army, China take it a disputed area that don't belongs to India. So that's get benefit for after this Doklam scenario. So it is a high time to fix trilateral border with dialogue between three countries, India, China and Nepal should sit together and settle which one is the 0 point in the border area. We have two such places. In the east, it is because we high mounted Kanchenjunga, there is no problem. But in west, India is occupying the big portion. We have experience. When two big elephant quarrels, the grass, that is bad consequences. So when there will be conflict, that is bad for Nepal. But if two elephant loves, it makes also very difficulties, created difficulty. That is in surface. Akash Patal Jamin, but the problem. That is the example, is Lipulek agreement. It is Nepal's territory, but India and China decided, agreed to allow pilgrimage and trade through that route. Nepalese people protested. So we have to defend ourselves. So when they love, then there is danger to small. So that is the reality. And you asking about external dimension. Now, India's, in old days, India take Nepal as her sphere of influence. But now, their policy is pro-Malaysia, not totally pro-Nepal, particularly after this Modi. We are facing silent demographic aggression. That is a serious threat to Nepal these days. Yes, Malaysia, in Tarai, we call Malaysia, the local Aboriginal peoples, they are Malaysia. And those people who are across the border, the local people, Malaysia calls them Desia. This flood, it is not only by an inundation problem particularly. It is because of Indian construction across the border, ring dams. So Tarai people, Malaysia people came to realize who are the problems for inundation. And they have Lal Purja, that is the land paper, ownership paper. But in political instability, they shift the border pillars, several lost. Malaysia owners, peasants are asking and raising the issue, but Malaysia leaders are not speaking. So this second, third election will be a test. So another thing I would like to share, that is, in our Nepalese history, only Kirat period that is ruled by Aboriginal Nepalese. Otherwise, the Gopalis, Mahishpal, Likshivi, Mallas, Ranas, and our president, first president, Mr. Yadav. They are either from India, they are all from Malaysia. The Likshivis were from Vaishali of India. Mallas, they are from Simrongad of Tarai, the Newar Mallas. So with Taleju they came when there was Muslim aggression. And Ranas and Sahas, they are proud to call that they are from Rajputana. Even one of the Saha king married Rana Bahadur Shah, which is Madhisi widow. So half Madhisi they are also. And Ram Baram Yadav, the first president of Nepal. So when in total history of 2000s, more than 1500 years, the Madhisis and origin of the India migrated people who ruled Nepal, who are responsible for discrimination? Who discriminated whom? Madhisi are not enjoying full right as Pahariyas in Nepal. That is foreign propaganda to make conflict between Madhisi and Pahari and to push their own agenda. That's the problem. And the original Madhisis are Nepalis. So when I was working in Tarai, I have said a slogan. Madhisi Pahari bye bye, Sima Pari ko Deshi like bye bye.
Ambassador Shrestha, your exuberant vote of thanks has the risk of becoming a keynote lecture. So,
Yes,
I think at this point we should thank you, sir,
Yeah.
and thank Mr. Thapa and Professor Rankin, and Awazing
Bahut Ramro, thank you. The Himalaya, you should good contribute to preserve Himalayan ecology and help to mitigate further possible earthquakes, and at the same time play a positive role to lessen foreign interference in Nepal dictation and domination. Help us to play more independently in our own affairs. Then it will be a solution, better solution. Thank you. Thank you.